Right. Well, good evening. Welcome back to Introduction to Composition and Research. And tonight we are going to a large degree, tilt over from the composing part, the composition part of this class, to the dealing with the research part. And that's the formatting of a research paper. Now, the two levels of formatting a research paper. We've already talked about the different formatting styles or formatting conventions: Turabian, Chicago Manual of Style, MLA, APA, SBL, and so forth. And you should have PDFs that give you basic information about that. Also some online references, Citation Machine and the OWL, Purdue, the online writing laboratory at Purdue, and some other sources that give you the conventions. You can actually print out a whole booklet of how to for the various formats. And I believe I sent you PDFs of those. Tonight, we're going to talk about two aspects of formatting a research paper. And those two aspects are the macro organization and the micro organization. Macro organization has to do with building the paper, the actual content of what you're researching, the subject matter, how you put that together, how it's presented. Macro organization for a research paper is what the paper is about. Now, a lot of students are intimidated by the idea of trying to put together all the pieces of a research paper. Admittedly, it can seem like a huge task. And the point of a lot of what we have covered so far has been to emphasize breaking down this material into smaller, more easily managed bites or pieces that you can then assemble into the finished product. Part of that is what macro organization is all about. Macro organization is the research, the study, the reading, the learning, all of that gathering of information. Micro organization has to do with the actual appearance of the finished product, how the research paper looks when you have put it together. The margins, the formatting, the proper form for documenting your sources, and that gets back to Chicago Manual of Style, Modern Language Association, APA, and so forth. But it's micro organization is how it looks. Macro organization is what it's about, what the subject is. We're going to start with macro organization. And there are 5 main parts to a research project or a research paper. And those 5 main parts, and this is basically true of all of the formatting conventions. Doesn't matter if you're talking about Turabian or MLA or APA or Society of Biblical Literature. It's basically true of all of them. Part number 1 would be the preliminary pages, whatever introductory pages are required for that particular format. And that might include a cover sheet or a title page, sometimes a cover sheet and a title page, a table of contents if it's needed or required, lists of illustrations, lists of charts, lists of tables, if the paper includes 2 or more of any of those. Now, if you have one chart or if you have one illustration or if you have one table in your paper, it's really pretty superfluous. It's pretty redundant. You see what I did there? You got superfluous and redundant. That's a redundancy. Those words mean basically the same thing. But it really doesn't make sense to include a list of illustrations if you only have one illustration. It really doesn't it makes sense to include a list of tables or charts if you only have one. That's really not necessary. But then it would also include things like appendices, the appendix, Sometimes in a large research paper, you may have 3 or 4 appendices. You might have one appendix of scripture references that are not quoted in the paper. You might have another appendix of ancient writers or something of that sort that are referenced but not quoted. All of these things would be presented at the end of the paper in an appendix of that particular variety of information. You could conceivably have half a dozen appendices in a large paper. But the first part, the 5 parts, number 1, are the required preliminary pages. And all of those things, I say pages because depending on the format, you may have half a dozen pieces of paper required by that format before you ever actually get to the report itself. You may look at that and say, well, that's just dumb. That's a waste of paper. And I agree. But that is the formatting convention, the formatting style requirement that has been standardized in academia for the past 100 years. And it largely remains in place in most institutions of higher learning. And that's part of what this class is all about. So, number 1, preliminary pages. Now we get to number 2, which is the introduction to your paper. And of course, we've talked about the introduction. It tells the reader, me, what your subject is, what you're writing about. It tells in very brief form what the subject is, what the hypothesis or expectation that you begin from is, and what you expect to find. And then you come to number 3, the body or the main text of the research paper. And here's where you lay out what you have learned. Now remember, a research paper is not meant to persuade. It's not a sermon. It's not a Bible class lesson. It's a demonstration of what you learned about this subject and where you learned it. And it shows what conclusions you draw, what you concluded about it, but we'll come to that in a moment. So you've got the preliminary pages, you've got the introduction, and it's labeled introduction. It's formal, it stands out. The body of the paper is not labeled body. It might have a subtitle depending on what your particular subject is. The 4th part in macro organization, in the content, we're not talking about the appearance right now, we're talking about the substance, the content of the paper. The 4th part is your summary of what you've learned, your summary of the research, followed by the conclusions that you've drawn. So in the introduction, you say, here's what I'm going to study, and sometimes here's what I expect to find, or here's what I think will happen, or here's where I think this will take me. In the body of the paper, here's what I found, here's what I learned, here's what these words mean, here's what this logical syllogism shows or demonstrates, here's an illustration, here's another illustration, here's information that contradicts that, and so on and so on and so forth. And so then you come to your summary and say, all right, here's what it all boils down to. Here's what I learned about this. And then you draw your conclusion. And that's where, after the summary, after you put it all together and say, here's what the information shows, in the conclusion, then you say, well, I really didn't expect this to be the result. Or this is exactly what I expected. Or the implications of this are. This is where it leads us in practical terms. The conclusion is where you make any practical application of the information. But again, it's not a sermon. You're not trying to persuade, you're trying to demonstrate. In doing that with a summary and showing the practical applications, what you're showing is, here's what I take away from it. Here's the change that I should make, or here's the information that I should carry with me. Here's how I should apply this information. Now, number 5, preliminary pages, whatever is required by the particular documentation format you adopt or are required. Introduction, the main body of your research, the summary and the conclusion, number 4. Number 5 is a bibliography, or a works cited page. Now, if you're using Turabian, that is the Chicago Manual of Style, the older style of documentation, you'll put in a bibliography. And a bibliography lists all of the sources that you used in your research, listed alphabetically by the last name of the first author or editor. Not in the order that they appear in the paper, but alphabetically. A works cited page gives less information, but works basically the same way. It simply gives the works that you used in the paper itself. Now, there's an important point here. As far as the content of the paper, that's part 2, part 3, part 4, the main paper itself, not just the preliminary and the bibliography or works cited, whatnot, the actual writing part of it. Listen carefully. The introduction and the body of the paper and the summary and conclusions not only should, but must harmonize informationally with each other. That means you don't introduce new information in your summary. You don't make reference in your conclusion to something that you have not referenced or has no background or basis in the body or the introduction of your paper. The introduction sets the stage for the body reports what you've learned, the summary evaluates the gist of what you have learned, and the conclusion says, here's how it can be or should be used. Okay. How do you sit down and write it? Now, I've already mentioned that the logical approach, start at the beginning, introduction, is not usually for most students the most practical approach. Because if you sit down and try to write the introduction first, in doing that, you're trying to summarize all of the information that you've learned before you're ready to write the summary. So, the most practical approach for composing your research paper, as I've already pointed out, is actually, in most cases, to begin at the beginning of the body. Start with your information. Start with what you're learning along the way. Write the body of the paper. That lets you, number one, that lets you get right to the heart of the subject. I'm writing about Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage. Okay, where's a logical place to start for that? Matthew 5, verse 32. And then go from there to Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12. And then go from there to Mark's references. And go from there then on to perhaps what the apostles taught on the subject. Or, what am I writing on? I'm writing about the gift of the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38. What does Peter say there? Repent ye and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then verse 39 adds, for unto you is the promise, and unto your children, and unto all them that are afar off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. All right, so I'm going to write this paper about what is the gift of the Holy Spirit in Acts 2, verse 38. Where's the logical place to begin? Acts 2, verse 38. So, it makes more sense to start with the body of the paper, to carry out the information, to write it down in the order that the research led you through. And that lets you get, number one, it lets you get right to the heart of the subject. Number two, it lets you present what you've learned in more or less a chronological order, point by point or chapter by chapter. Particularly if it's a longer paper, it might be chapter after chapter after chapter. It lets you present the information. It lets you show how your learning develops, how your understanding develops. I started here, I learned this, that led me here, I learned this, that combined with this produces this, and so forth. Now, when the body of the research paper has been written, that part that shows basically in synopsis everything that you've learned about this subject, it becomes really pretty easy at that point to summarize what you've learned. Write your summary. Here's what I learned about it. And here's the conclusion that I have drawn. This is the logical application of it. And after you've done that, then you can go back and survey that, maybe even read it over, read it aloud 2 or 3 times, and say, okay, I can condense this. I can summarize this as an introduction. I can tell you what this is about in the following 5 or 10 sentences or 2 paragraphs. It's much easier to write the introduction at that point because the body of the paper and the summary and the conclusion serve as a kind of roadmap to guide your thoughts. You can read that and say, okay, here's where I started, and that led me here, and that those things combined led me here. And so I can just point out, this is where I start, and these are the way stations, or these are the stops along the way, and there's your introduction. Now, go back to the macro organization aspect of this as far as the actual parts of the research paper are concerned. So, your preliminary pages. Preliminary pages. Cover sheet, which is usually a blank page. It's just to protect the title page. Think of it as like the end papers in a book. You open the cover of the book and there's a blank page there normally. Some paperbacks omit that, but normally there's a blank page there, and its real purpose is to protect the actual printed pages. So a cover sheet. And that would be followed by a title page. And that title page is going to include the title of your research paper and the school name and the course or the class and a course number if it's applicable. It will have your name and the date when the paper was submitted or when it was due. So school name, paper title, class name, course number if you need to, your name, and the date. And then you might perhaps include a table of contents. Table of contents, if it's necessary. You might include lists, as we talked about, if they're necessary. And you might include lists of supplementary information as well. Now, for biblical and theological research papers, it can be helpful if you're going to use a lot of different Bible versions. It might be very helpful to provide a list of commonly used abbreviations for various Bible versions. Now, it's generally understood that most Bible versions are abbreviated with three-letter abbreviations: KJV for King James Version, NKJ, New King James, ASV, American Standard Version, NAS, New American Standard, ESV, NIV, RSV. Now, you get to some of the more esoteric translations, the Living Bible Paraphrased, LBP, or the Message, MES, something like that. But it's generally understood that biblical quotations, if they're not denoted by those abbreviations, it's generally understood that they'll be taken from the King James Version. Another helpful list of abbreviations for some research papers is a list of references to what are called standard theological reference works. For example, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia is abbreviated ISBE. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, multi-volume work, is typically abbreviated TN or TDNT. Kittle's Lexicon of the Greek Language, 10 volumes, huge reference work, is usually just abbreviated as Kittel, Kittel. And there are other large standard reference works like that that might be simply shorthanded in that way. Now, let's go back and talk about these 5 pieces just a little bit more and how they work together. The preliminary parts of the paper we've talked about. The introduction is the reader's guide to the paper. And the introduction should provide 3 basic pieces of information. And we've already talked about this in general. I want to be more specific. The introduction should tell the reader what the topic or the problem addressed in the paper is. It should tell the reader, number 2, how the information on that subject was located or found or discovered, and how it was studied, what the study methodology of the student was. And it should tell, number 3, what the initial or the expected result of the study is. When you started, what did you expect this to show? What position, what preconception did you bring to this, if there was any? Now, the length of the introduction is going to vary according to the length and the complexity of the topic and the paper itself. But here's the point, and here's why you typically would want to write the introduction last. The introduction should touch all the parts of the paper. The introduction to a 10-page or a 20-page research paper might require 1 to 2 pages. If you're writing a master's level thesis or a doctoral dissertation that's going to span 300 to 600 pages, your introduction might run 20 to 30, 40 pages because it takes that much space to cover, to touch all the things that you'd cover in that dissertation. Now, the body of the research paper, and I've talked about this. This is the main part where you fully explain what you learned, where you report what you learned. And you can divide that main part, that body, into different sections. Maybe you've got several different aspects of a subject you want to address. Maybe you're studying the meaning of a particular Greek word. Let's say, for example, the word sallo, P-S-A-L-L-O, that's used in James chapter 5. That was one of your earlier writing assignments. And you want to study the etymology of the word sallo, because go back to the times of classical Greek in the days of of Greek philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And that word solo means to pluck or to twang, like you might pluck a guitar string. However, James uses it, and New Testament writers use it clearly with reference to the human voice. And sometimes denominational writers and scholars will try to say, well, you go back to classical Greek, and this is what it means. It has to do with plucking or twanging. So that means that it's all right to use guitars and instruments and lyres and harps and so forth in worship. Does that hold true? So you're going to study the etymology, which means the origin and the development in usage of this word over a span of time. And in the body of your research, you might want to break that down to the meaning of the word solo in classical Greek, which would be 300 to 400 years before the time of Jesus, and the meaning of the word solo in the Greek of the intertestamental period, moving down closer to the time of Jesus, about the time of the Maccabees, basically, a couple of hundred years before Jesus, and the common understanding or the meaning of the word solo as it was typically used in first century Koine, common Greek. And as you study this word, you discover the meaning has changed as time went by. Well, words change in meaning, don't they? What does the word gay, G-A-Y, mean to most English speakers in the 21st century? It does not mean what it meant 50 years ago. In 1974, to the average English speaker, the word G-A-Y meant happy. In 2024, to the average English speaker, the word gay means attracted sexually to a person of the same sex. And happiness is nowhere in that equation. Words do change in meaning. That's etymology etymology in practice, etymology in process. So that's what you might show in the separate sections of your body of your research. Now, that brings you then from the preliminaries to the introduction to the body, and then to the summary and conclusions. And we'll just abbreviate that because I don't like bending over to write on the board. And again, I realize I am repeating myself probably much more than I need to. A research paper is not a sermon. The summary draws together everything that you've discovered. The whole purpose of the summary is to say, okay, teacher, this is where my research led me, and this is what I learned. Do not present new information that you have not already touched on and referenced and documented. Don't present new information in the summary. It belongs in the body. If you get to the summary and you find yourself still adding new information, that tells you one thing. You know what that tells you? You're not done with the body of your paper yet. Let me rephrase that. You are not yet done with the body of your paper. The summary doesn't have to be long. It can be comparatively brief. The conclusions, the applications that you make might be significantly longer than the summary. Sometimes, even for a 10 or 20 page research paper, you can write your entire summary in the space of a paragraph or two or three, a half a page, 3/4 of a page. Sometimes. But the application may take you 5 more pages. And then there are those appendices that we mentioned. And an appendix is an additional section, an additional piece of the paper that includes related information on the main subject. It is information that relates to the main subject, but it's not necessarily essential to your particular study. It might be information that relates to one of the main points in the paper, but it doesn't change what you did with it or what you learned from it. It might be something to explore later on. The bibliography, the works cited pages, that's which one you use is determined by which citation style you are using. As I said, Turabian, the Chicago Manual of Style, specifies a bibliography. The Modern Language Association, the American Psychological Association, and the Society of Biblical Literature, if memory serves me, all require a works cited page. These newer styles are all about brevity. And to older people like me, that's a little frustrating because we're used to very thorough documentation. That's what we were taught. So, how do you organize the body of your paper? Well, each section, or if it's a longer paper, each chapter of that paper, that body, should be a self-contained unit. It focuses on its own major point or type of information. Now, I introduced you several weeks ago to something called Barnes' Basic Outline. For those of you who intend to preach, Barnes' Basic Outline is a very practical way of outlining a sermon so that you can preach it. Your main point, your subpoint, your sub-subpoint that supports that subpoint that supports that main point, second subpoint that follows logically behind the first subpoint, and so on. And then you get to the second point and the third point. If you follow that basic outline, if you take all of your information for your research paper and lay it out with that outline, here's point number one, and you're just going to make that first point in a single statement, a sentence or two, and then all the things that relate to point number one, a sentence, a sub-sentence, a sub-sentence, another sentence, another sub-sentence, another sub-sentence, and so forth, then that would be your first section of your research paper, your first section of the body, or your first chapter if it's a longer paper. Everything in that point or in that section, that chapter, it all relates to that major point, that basic type of information. If you're doing an exegetical study of a passage, for example, you might look at context as one point and the language as another point, and the common interpretations as a third point. So there you have your three sections of your body. All of the information in each point should be of that particular type, that it should all relate to that point. All of the information on Greek or Hebrew sources, for example, that affects the meanings of key words in a Bible passage, that would be all in that one section dealing with the language, for example. All of the historical interpretations or historical applications of a particular passage. This is how it was understood in the 1st century. This is how the proto-Catholic denomination understood it in the 5th century. This is how the reformers understood it in the 15th century. This is how it was interpreted by the charismatics in the 19th century. This is the interpretation of the skeptics of the 20th century, so forth. All of these things would be in one particular section of the body. Any cultural factors that are affected by that passage or that affect that passage, that give it a particular understanding, those would all be in their own separate or distinct section or chapter, if you will. So, let me give you about 4 how-tos for the writing process, because at this point in the course, you're getting close. You should have been doing some studying and some research and some looking for information all along these last 6 or 7 weeks. So you should be getting close to beginning to put this all together, or beginning to kind of outline what you're learning and figuring out how it fits together so that you can actually write the paper. So here are 4 basic how-tos that address how to write the paper. Research writing can address a wide range, a wide variety of subjects. And it can be conducted, research can be conducted in a variety of ways. Now, as I've said before, in this class and for the school here, Georgia School of Preaching, the vast majority of your research is going to be literary, linguistic, and historical. You're going to look at encyclopedias, at commentaries, at lexicons, at historical books, and so forth, relating to biblical subjects or particular passages of Scripture. So that narrows it pretty dramatically. But research can be conducted in a variety of ways depending on the subject. And there are some ways of presenting your results that are better suited to particular types of research than others. So, having said that, number one, how-to number one, it's often easiest, most logical to present historical research, information on historical topics or historical events in a chronological way. Document the development of a subject or the sequence of events as they unfold over the passing of time. That makes sense. We live in a linear time frame in this world. So it makes sense to present it, historical information that way. Number two, research that focuses, for example, on differences between things or maybe on similarities between things. For example, the differences between the Christian concept of heaven or the biblical concept of heaven and the Islamic concept of heaven. You could most often present those most easily as a series of contrasts or comparisons because you're focused on the differences or on the similarities. So you have contrast. That's very sensible, very logical. Number three, research into a particular topic might be presented in a cause and effect format. For example, factors that influenced the growth of churches of Christ in the United States between 1830 and 1930. That's a historical study, but you're also looking at not necessarily historical factors per se, but societal and cultural factors and educational factors, political influences. Civil War fell in that period as well. You're looking at a variety of things that would have influenced that particular subject. Number four, a practical or what you might call an application research study might be presented. And this gets a little away from what we typically wind up doing in the school, but that might be presented as a journal or a journey that records the theory or the basic concept, what the Bible or does not say about this particular subject, from concept, the journey to practical application in the modern world. And you could present that in a chronological way as well. All of that has to do with macro organization, the content, the substance of what you're studying and that you will write about. Now let's talk about micro organization. Just a moment. And micro organization really is not hard. It's tedious for some students, but it's really not difficult because micro organization is all about how the paper looks. Now, we talked about preliminary pages, and that has something to do with how it looks. But here, micro organization, we're actually talking about the paper itself, the appearance of it. In this, we're talking about formatting. Typically, in all of these formatting conventions, all of these formatting citation styles, you're going to have a 1-inch margin all the way around your paper. 1 inch left, 1 inch right, 1 inch top, 1 inch bottom. If you go into Microsoft Word or Pages, or if you're a Luddite who still uses WordPerfect, or if you're a genuine Luddite who still works in DOS and uses WordStar or Lotus ME Pro or something like that, Word Pro, then the standard setup, the standard blank page template in most of those word processing applications gives you a 1 inch margin all the way around. That's just pretty well standard. Sometimes, though, you have to set the margins yourself. All the lines, pay attention. All the lines and all the paragraphs in a research paper, regardless of which citation format you're using, all the lines, all the paragraphs are normally double spaced, not single spaced. Double spaced, not space and a half. Double spaced. Except for paragraph length quotations. That would be quotations that run 2 or more sentences, basically, 2 or more complete sentences. Now, if the sentences are, he ran and she fell down, that wouldn't necessarily need to be different. But normally, paragraph length quotations are going to be single spaced and they're indented 1/2 inch from the margins, which means that they would come in a quotation. You've got your double spaced writing here, 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 and now your quotation is going to begin here and run single spaced over to 1/2 inch from the 1 inch margin. All the pages, every single page in your research paper is printed on one side only. You don't print both sides of the paper. It uses more paper that way, I know. That's just the standard academic convention. That's not a GSOP rule. That's not us. That's just the way it's done at the collegiate level. Research papers should use a consistent, a uniform font or typeface and a uniform type size throughout the whole paper. Now, typically, that's going to be either Times New Roman, 12 point, or it will be Arial or sans serif or Helvetica, one of those very blocky type typefaces, 12 point. You don't use fancy types. You don't use italic types all the way through, anything like that. You just use a very standardized typeface and size. Some schools will allow smaller type sizes for endnotes, for footnotes, for bibliographical entries, and sometimes for quotations. But that's a school by school basis, not a citation format basis. Number 3, so you got your margins 1 inch all around. Everything is double spaced one side of the page only, except paragraph length quotations that are indented 1/2 inch and single spaced, all written, all typed in the same font, all printed on one side of the page only. Let's talk about headings, the introduction, the title, and so forth. There are basically 3 levels of heading that you're going to put in your paper. The first level heading indicates the main parts of the paper, the introduction and the summary. You don't usually put the word body or text for the body of the paper. You just go from the introduction. Maybe some schools would add a blank line between the introduction and the beginning of the body. An empty line is between the end of a previous paragraph and a new heading. But the first level headings typically are centered on the page, centered left to right, and they're bold-faced. Chapter titles, if you write a paper long enough to have a chapter titles are considered first level headings. So you'd have a heading that says introduction and a heading that says summary, but you're not going to have a heading that says body. You're just going to go into the body of the paper. Second level or subheadings are things that show a subdivision of a main part of the paper. For instance, the body. If you're going to break your body into several sections, maybe you're going to talk about linguistic data, and then you're going to talk about historical data and maybe geographical data, then your secondary level heading, your subheading, is going to show this is historical data, for example. You wouldn't probably say it quite that way, but you would use some title or some statement that says that's what this is. And those sections are centered just like the first level, but they're not bold-faced. And there must be, here's a basic principle, a basic rule. There must be at least 2 subheadings under a first level heading. If you remember in Barnes' basic outline, you have Roman numeral number 1, and then you have capital A, capital B, capital C. Under C, you might have numeral 1 and numeral 2. But if you don't have a 2 to follow that 1, you don't have a 1. You just have the information under capital C. Under Roman numeral number 1, your main point, if you don't have a B and a C, then you don't have an A. You just have that main point. You don't, and I realize that in modern word processing applications, Microsoft Word and so forth, you can use formatting templates that will give you different styles of outlining. 1.1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.1.2, 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and so forth. And they will let you have a single subpoint. You don't do that in a research paper. If you don't have at least 2 subheadings, then you don't use a subheading. If you don't have an A, if you don't have a B, you don't need an A. If you don't have a 2, you don't need a 1. The same holds true in writing the paper. There must be at least 2 subheadings under a first level heading, or you just don't need a subheading. Third level headings or subheadings are separate parts of the subheading, the second level division. If you get to that point, we're talking about linguistic issues on this subject. So there's your basic heading, that's bolded, linguistic issues, and your subheading is Hebrew issues, and your other subheading is Greek issues. But then under Greek issues, you're going to talk about classical Greek and intertestamental Greek and Koine Greek and modern Greek. So those are your third level. So we go from linguistic to Hebrew, Greek, and then the things that relate to Greek. That's third level. Those would be bolded, but they're at the left margin. From your perspective, the left margin of the page. There's no indentation. They're not indented half an inch or space or what have you. And just like subheads, if you're going to have a third level, a sub heading, you got to have at least two, or you don't need a sub heading. It's very uncommon in a research paper such as you'll write for this school in any of your classes to get down to fourth level headings, subdivisions of subdivisions of subheadings. That would be very, very uncommon. Now, if you're writing a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, you may go 10 levels deep into this, but you're not doing that for Georgia School of Preaching. If you get to that fourth level, then those sub headings would be at the left margin, but they're not bold-faced. And always, every time you move to another level, another sub-level, you should have at least two entries at that level. Okay. We need to talk about enumerations and documentation, and we will do that after we take about a 15-minute break. I'll stop here, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Okay, let's get started again. As you can see on the board behind me, we've changed topics. We need to talk just a moment or two about enumerations. Enumerations in a research paper are a visual tool that you use to help organize material and information. It may be in a written report, it may be within a paragraph, might even be within a sentence. Sometimes you'll find a sentence that makes a proposition, thus and such and so. The possibilities are number one in parentheses, number two, parentheses, number three, and it's usually just the closed parentheses, not both parentheses. In a paragraph, enumerations are formatted just like a new paragraph. So you've got a paragraph, your lines, the first line is indented and it goes like this, and the second line comes back to the margin, third line comes back to the margin. Now you're going to introduce an enumeration, and that means you've got to have at least two. So you would say, number one, such and such and so and so. Number two, such and such and so and so. Number three, such and such and so and so. So you see it always comes back to the margin. It's indented just like a regular paragraph. They're double spaced, just like the rest of the paper. A period follows each item. So you have a period here, you have one space, a single space between the period after the number and the beginning of whatever you're writing. You get to the end of that, you've got a period, you got, not there, you got a period, you got a period. Just like regular sentences. There may be several sentences after each number. It may be basically a paragraph of its own. If the list is long enough that you reach double digits, 10, 11, 12, 25, then you change your indentation here and add one more space before the one. So you'd have the indentation, a blank space, and then your numbers, so that when you get to double digits, the double digits line up as they should. All the periods are aligned. I just said that wrong. I just said that incorrectly. You would add the space here. Take away the space here, I'm sorry, so that the periods align. That's what you need to remember. The periods should line up. If you get to triple digits in your list is too long. In sentences, now that's about paragraphs. In sentences, enumerations, that's a numbered list. That's what an enumeration is. Enumerations can be formatted either with numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or with letters in parentheses, A, B, C, normally capitals, capital A, capital B, capital C. Some folks will use lowercase letters, A, B, C. Numbers usually represent a larger division. Normally, if you're going to enumerate something in a sentence, you start with numbers, and then if you get to smaller things, you would go to letters then. Numbered items are set off from one another. In other words, you get to the end of that numbered item, number 1, you put a comma, parentheses, number 2, that material, comma, parentheses, number 3, unless the items that you're enumerating actually contain punctuation, then they are separated by semicolons. In the class notes, you'll find some examples of these on page 70, and I'll get that to you. Now let's talk about documentation. I mentioned enumeration because some writers in some papers will need to make use of this. The average student in a typical research paper probably will not have anything he needs to enumerate or she needs to enumerate, unless you have a list of something. Documentation. 3 basic types of documentation used in a research paper. You have reference notes, you have content notes, and you may have bibliographic information. And of course, in a bibliography, you will have bibliographic information. But sometimes you'll have a need to include some of that bibliographic information in the text of the paper. Now that's not necessarily a full bibliographic entry in the text of your paper, but you may need to make note of the year of publication or something like that. And you would include that information enough to document it. Documentation does 3 things, and we've made this point before. Documentation, A, verifies that you actually researched and found legitimate sources to validate what you write. In other words, you didn't just make it up. It's not just your opinion. Number 2, it proves that you searched competently and you located legitimate academic sources of information. And number 3, it confirms your integrity as a researcher, as a student. It shows that you didn't plagiarize, you didn't steal the information from someone. You actually read it, studied it, digested it, and you're explaining it or expressing it. Now, when we talk about reference notes, what we're talking about are footnotes or end notes. And the difference basically is location. Footnotes are at the bottom of the page where the reference occurs. End notes are either, depending on the length of the paper, they're either at the end of the section or at the end of the paper. If it's a master's thesis, a doctoral dissertation, they might be at the end of the chapter. Whereas for the papers you write for the school, they'll be at the end of the paper. Reference notes, the proper form for reference notes is determined by the citation style that you use, whether it's Turabian or Modern Language Association, American Psychological Association, APA, what have you. Reference notes serve 3 purposes. They show the authority behind what you're writing, behind the statements you make. They help a scholar, someone who comes behind and reads what you've written. They help the scholar find the source of information that you consulted. Where'd you learn this? Here's where you learned it. And number three, they're a public admission, a public recognition, basically, that says, I am indebted to these sources, these writers, these researchers for this information. It's a gesture. Think of it as a thank you. It's a gesture of intellectual honesty. It says, I acknowledge these sources. I acknowledge the work that these people before me did so that I could learn this information. Now, content notes are things that provide information that otherwise would complicate or distract from the flow of thought in your writing, in your text. Contrasts, discrepancies, further explanations of sources or other sources and so forth. And the point about content notes is that what you're writing, your text, should make sense even without them. If you just take out that content note, it might be a parenthetical statement. You could take that out and what you're writing should still make sense. Bibliographic entries, we've talked about already, alphabetical order by the first or the primary author's or editor's last name. And of course, that comes at the end of the paper. So now let's turn our attention from all of this formatting business to the textbook for a few minutes and talk about how you write. And this is, we're going to be in lesson 9 or chapter 9. In the 6th edition, it's page 191. And this lesson is entitled Elegance. And that's appropriate, given that Williams is writing about writing with style and clarity and grace. I want to draw your attention to 2 of the quotes on page 191. Frank L. Lucas is credited with recording a conversation between President Calvin Coolidge and his wife. And Lucas records this as an illustration of clarity and brevity. But clarity and brevity, though a good beginning, are only a beginning, he writes. By themselves, they may remain bare and bleak. When Calvin Coolidge, asked by his wife what the preacher had preached on, replied, sin, and asked what the preacher said, replied, he was against it. He was brief enough, but one hardly envies Mrs. Coolidge. Here's the point. He was clear and he was brief, but that wasn't much of a conversation, was it? Samuel Johnson is commonly considered one of the greatest English writers of the 1500s, if memory serves me, maybe early 1600s. And Samuel Johnson wrote, read over your compositions, and wherever you meet with a passage which you think is particularly fine, strike it out. The practical point of this entire lesson on elegance, which is how you write, the practical point is this: listen to how your written words sound. Now, I have emphasized again and again, when you write a paper, before you post it, before you hand it in, read it aloud, read it to yourself. Don't just read over it. Don't just skim over it. Read the words aloud. Pick it up, look at yourself in a mirror, and read. In literature, the ambition of the novice is to acquire the literary language. The struggle of the adept is to get rid of it. Read it out loud so that you can hear how it sounds. Because what you hear when you read it aloud is what anyone reading it, even silently, anyone besides you, is going to hear. Listen to how your written words sound, because that will help you develop elegance, style, grace in your writing. I can't tell you, and Williams makes this point on the next page, I can't tell you how to write an elegant sentence. I can't say you use this vocabulary and you put the words together in exactly this form. It varies from person to person. But there's a point here that Williams makes that I think is excellent. And that is, the best eloquence is disarming simplicity. The best eloquence, the best elegance is simplicity. We know the acronym that is sometimes posted, KISS. Keep it simple. You can fill in the last word. Has to do with being not smart. Now that maybe is a little bit blunt, but it speaks to what we're talking about in this respect. Keep it simple. There are some things you can do, some tools you can use that that will help you express your thoughts both simply or clearly and with style, elegantly. The first of these are what Williams calls balance and symmetry. I have tried to avoid doing a lot of reading from the text in this class because you have the book, or you should, and you're capable of reading it yourself, and you should. But in this case, I want to read a little bit for the sake of illustrating this point. Now, the most common kind of balance, and you'll hear what we're talking about in just a moment, depends on coordination, how things relate to each other. You can join or pair almost any two constructions or multiples of constructions, whether they coordinate or not. But when they are balanced and they coordinate, they work well together. Now, Walter Lippmann, who was a well-known writer of the 20th century, and Williams uses a quote from Lippmann and then changes it to illustrate his point. Walter Lippmann wrote, "The national unity of a free people depends upon a sufficiently even balance of political power to make it impracticable for the administration to be arbitrary and for the opposition to be revolutionary and irreconcilable. Where that balance no longer exists, democracy perishes. For unless all the citizens of a state are forced by circumstances to compromise, unless they feel that they can affect policy but that no one can wholly dominate it, unless by habit and necessity they have to give and take, freedom cannot be maintained." Now that's what Lippmann wrote. What Williams does is take that statement and alter it slightly. But his point is not that he is improving it. Lippmann's statement is lengthy, rather complex, but it's actually well balanced. It makes good sense, and it as you pay attention to it, it flows. Now, here's what you could do with it. Say the same thing and yet take something from it. The national unity of a free people depends upon a sufficiently even balance of political power to make it impractical for an administration to be arbitrary against a revolutionary opposition that is irreconcilably opposed to it. Where that balance no longer exists, democracy perishes, because unless all the citizens of a state are habitually forced by necessary circumstances to compromise in a way that lets them affect policy with no one dominating it, freedom cannot be maintained. There's nothing wrong with the second sentence, second paragraph, really. But in the original, the statements, the clauses echo each other. You have concepts that balance each other. You have arbitrary versus revolutionary. You have compromise and domination. You have a balance of ideas in that first example, even though it's a little bit longer and more complex to read. He balances the sounds of the words. Here's why you want to read what you write out loud. What does it sound like? Does it sound awkward? If what you write sounds awkward to you, how do you think it's going to sound to me? How do you think it's going to sound to anybody else who reads it? Now, let me digress for just a moment. This is the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. And many of you who take this class either because you want to preach, or you are preaching, or you are learning to be a preacher. One of the helpful things you can do for your preaching is to practice preaching. And by that, I don't mean try to have somewhere lined up every Sunday where you can preach. That's great. There are plenty of congregations in Georgia who need a preacher every Sunday. That's part of why GSOP exists. But what I mean when I say practice preaching is when you prepare a sermon, don't go into the pulpit with that being the very first time you've ever heard that sermon. Now, after you have done this for 25 years, 40 years, 50 years, maybe you can take the back of an envelope and sketch out a few points and a few scripture references and take your Bible and step into the pulpit and preach a great, great sermon right off the back of that envelope. But until you have those years of experience, and by the way, I don't know any 40, 50-year preacher who does that when he can avoid it. Until you have those years of experience, you need to hear your own sermons, and not in retrospect, not after they've been preached. You do need to listen to the recordings of them if they're recorded, because you can improve. But before you ever step into the pulpit to preach them to the congregation, take your sermon outline, go to the pulpit, or if you're not there at the church building, go to the bathroom in your house and prop it up on the sink and look at yourself in the mirror and preach that sermon to yourself so that you can hear how it sounds. I guarantee you will make changes that will improve it. Now, with the papers you write, do the same thing. Go in the bedroom, sit in front of the dresser, go in the bathroom, stand in front of the mirror, read aloud so you can hear how it sounds. You can hear the balance or the imbalance. You can hear the awkwardness or the phrases that seem to really flow well. You can hear what needs improvement. You can hear the things that will make it better. Now, we talk about balance and symmetry, things that go together. Balanced coordination. That's Lippmann's statement. Lippmann's passage is an illustration of that. But flip the page, and you have some examples here on page 194 that Williams offers you. Illustrations that extend the ideas of topic and stress into phrases and clauses and how they balance with each other. The national unity of a free people depends upon a sufficiently even balance of political power to make it impracticable for the administration to be arbitrary and for the opposition to be revolutionary and irreconcilable. Now you notice the administration and the opposition, those are the main thoughts, and they balance each other. And arbitrary and revolutionary and irreconcilable, those are the sub points or the sub thoughts, and they're in symmetry to each other. They relate to each other. Lippmann balances the opposing topics of administration and opposition, and he closes that by balancing those other words, those stressed meanings. Arbitrary, revolutionary, irreconcilable. You have a balance between them. They're opposed to each other. Now, notice how he concludes. Where that balance no longer exists, democracy perishes. Now, Lippmann, among other things, was a professional writer. He wrote for a living. He knew what he was doing, and he did it on purpose. Williams goes on and talks about the intricacy, the complexity of what he wrote. And it is complex, but it's not complicated. It's complex. There's a lot there. But Lippmann arranges what's there so that even an average reader might have to read over it a couple of times to pick it up. But Lippmann arranges it so that even an average reader can follow the basic thought and get the basic points and see how they relate to each other. And Williams gives 4 examples of this on page 195. He repeats references to citizens as the subject or the topic of each clause in that paragraph. Now, he had to use a passive in one case, in the first example, and that's okay. We talk about using active verbs and active forms as much as possible. He could have used an active form there, but it served his purpose to create balance, to create a harmony of sorts by using a passive. Passives are not wrong, but they're not scholarly or high flown. They're just passive. So you got citizens, all the citizens, citizens are forced, so on and so forth. He repeats references that focuses you on what the subject is, what the basic topic is. Now he balances things, force and feel, affect policy, dominate policy, dominate it. In the last clause, that last statement, unless all the citizens, unless they feel, unless by habit and necessity they have, unless, what does he do there? He balances habit against necessity and the stress of give and take. And he concludes that long, long sentence. And There are long sentences in that paragraph. Long sentences are not wrong, but long sentences are complex. It introduces the opportunity for errors. Short sentences usually simplify things. Long sentences sometimes make them live. But after that long sentence, he concludes with a very short sentence that balances everything that came before it. So you have coordinated balance or balanced coordination. The whole idea is to make things, to present actions and counteractions, as it were, or thoughts and counter thoughts, so that there's nothing dangling in the way it sounds or in the way it feels to read it. But you can have uncoordinated balance as well, and that's the second thing. There's an example here. The whole subject balance is a single object. Scientists whose research creates revolutionary views of the universe invariably upset those of us who construct our vision of reality out of our common sense experience of it. So you've got two things that are balanced: scientists on the one hand and those of us on the other, and revolutionary views and common sense experience. There's balance there, but it's not coordinated as the others were. Now, flip the page and you've got a whole series of examples. And a government unwilling to listen to the moderate hopes of its citizenry must eventually answer to the harsh justice of its revolutionaries. Those of us concerned with our school systems will not sacrifice the intellectual growth of our innocent children to the social engineering of incompetent bureaucrats. Were I trading scholarly principles for financial security, I would not be writing short books on minor subjects for small audiences. These sentences balance subordinate clauses and the objects of those subordinate clauses with the objects of the main clauses and so forth. None of these is coordinated. Each of them is balanced. Now, here's the point. Don't get bogged down in trying to do this on purpose. When you can introduce two opposed thoughts or concepts or figures, government and citizens, for example, and then follow that up with two compared or contrasting actions or descriptions, moderation and revolution, or innocence and incompetence. When you can do that and make it feel natural, when you can do that and make it illustrate something, that's great. But look, if you will, at the last example he gives under that section on page 197, when he says, in his earliest years, Picasso was not only a master draftsman of the traditional human form, but you fill in the blank. What's he doing here? He's showing you that by contrasting, by comparing something, by balancing this with that, what was Picasso in his later years? He was a master artist. Not just a master draftsman, but also a master artist of the human form. What he's showing you is that by balancing these things, by having symmetry, the things that go together, You can express and illustrate your thoughts in ways that will stick. They'll not just register in the mind of the reader, they'll stick in the mind of the reader. Now, another of the tools that he mentions here is climactic emphasis. And he describes that with what he calls light and heavy words. And makes the point, when a reader gets to the end of a sentence, they expect words that deserve rhetorical emphasis. Or in other words, when you're reading a sentence and you come to the end of the sentence, you expect the sentence to end. You expect it to be clear, this thought is over. This thought is complete. Which is why run-on sentences are such a frustration to read, by the way. The rhythm of the sentence, the way the words fit together, should carry you to that strength, to that strong close, that end, that, okay, that's the end of this thought. That's the completion of this thought. That's why you want to read your papers out loud, so you can hear those things. Now, Winston Churchill died when I was 5 years old. I am just old enough to remember who he was in my own life, to be aware of him. And as a youngster, I was just old enough to be aware of his speeches as I grew older. And Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England during World War II, later Prime Minister of England in the 1950s, is commonly recognized as one of the greatest English writers and one of the greatest English speakers, orators of the modern era. Williams takes a sentence from one of his best known speeches, Their Finest Hour, which was the speech in 1940 where Churchill praises the pilots of the Royal Air Force who had defended Britain against Nazi bombing during what's called the Battle of Britain. And he lifts a statement from that, a sentence from that speech, to emphasize this point about light and heavy words. He ends the speech with parallelism, ideas that go side by side, balances them with heavy nominalizations, and that's where you take a verb, an action, and make a noun of it. Use it as a noun. Remember that. And here's how he says it. At the end of the speech, he winds it up, until in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. Now, in context, what he was saying is we're waiting on the Americans to come into the war because we can't win this by ourselves. He could have said that much more simply, until in God's good time, the new world rescues us. Who would remember that? Churchill had an awareness of words that stick in the mind, and he used them very effectively. Now, talking about stress, you've got light words and heavy words, and there the heavy words are the rescue and the liberation of the old world. That is Great Britain. A very heavy emphasis. 3 other devices that can be used for stress to emphasize something. The word of plus a nominalization. Well, that's what you have in Churchill's usage, minus the preposition, minus the of. The rescue and the liberation of the old. Well, the old what? Old there is an adjective, but it's a nominalization for the old world or for Great Britain. I won't take the time to read Edward Gibbon's quotation here and the revision of it because it's lengthy. Gibbon was a typical writer of 19th century Britain, which means it's a bit wordy. But like Churchill, his words are worth reading. Of plus a nominalization. That word is hard for me to say. Sorry. Substitute a nominalization for the subject or for the object in this case, and it gives force to what is being said. Number two, a stress device, another way you can add stress. Echo salience, that is things that relate to each other, that echo a thought. I have written these essays to anatomize this familiar yet really strange being. Style, the centaur. The book may be read as an extended critical commentary on Buffon's famous saying that the style is the man. What is a centaur? A centaur is a mythical creature. What is a man? Man really exists. Style is a centaur. Style is a myth in some respects. And yet we recognize it in the man. The third stress tool, emphasis tool, is something called chiasmus. If you take the course on hermeneutics in the Georgia School of Preaching, you'll be introduced to chiasmus. It's a hermeneutical device in that context. It's not a common tool in English literature. Williams writes, this is a rarefied way, it's an uncommon way of creating emphasis, interesting perhaps only to those who have a taste for obscure matters of style. It's called chiasmus from the Greek word for crossing. Chi, the letter X in Greek. It's not common in English. It's actually very common in the Bible. It's very common in Hebrew particularly, and less so, but still fairly common in Greek. If you take your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 9, for example, in Genesis chapter 9, you have an example of a chiasmus. At verse 6, you have this admonition. Moses writes in verse 5, for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Now, in the context, what is Moses talking about? Back up to verse 4, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Life is in the blood. Come down to verse 6, and here's an example of a chiasmus, a crossing, if you will. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man, his blood shall be shed. For God made man in his own image. The first two lines, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. So the chiasmus works like this. You've got blood shed by man. Therefore, by man, blood shall be shed. You have a crossing of thoughts. It's a rhetorical device, it's a hermeneutical device to emphasize something. Now, you take Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, and simplify it. You might say, if you shed a man's blood, you'll pay with yours. That's sort of chiastic, but it doesn't have the ring. It doesn't have the emphasis. It doesn't have the obvious juxtapositioning of thoughts that this formulation does. You find this also in the New Testament. An example there would be in Mark chapter 2, in verse 27, in the words of Jesus there. In Mark chapter 2, on the Sabbath day at verse 23, one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields. As they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence," older translations say the showbread, "which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them," here's the chiasmus, "the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The way that the academic folks would write this, you've got the Sabbath made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But the way the academic folks express this is you've got A, B, B, A. You have thought A followed by thought B, followed by thought B restated in some way, followed by thought A restated in some way. A, B, B, A. And a chiasmus can go even beyond that. It can be A, B, C, C, B, A. Or sometimes in the Old Testament, you'll find A, B, C, B, A, where C is an unrelated center thought. Not unrelated, but a non-chiastic center thought. Here's the point. There are a lot of ways that you can give force, punch, power to what you write. Very few good writers are able to sit down and say, I'm going to write this research paper, and I am going to write it with balanced symmetry and balance and coordination. And I'm going to use chiasmuses, and I'm going to use all of these things in the course of it to make it really ring. What you do as a good writer is you write your basic thoughts and you read them and you ask, how can I improve this? How can I make this sound better? How can I make this feel more balanced? How can I make this flow better? How can I give this more force? And then you make your word changes on the basis of those questions. You don't say, how can I fit a chiasmus in here? If you do that, if you approach it that way, I guarantee it will be agony to read. Now, there's one other thing that I'll mention that Williams brings out in this chapter on elegance. And that's what he calls extravagant elegance. This is page 200. And that's where you combine the preposition of with a nominalization of the old, as Churchill said. You combine that with balanced parallel constructions, and you create resumptive and summative modifiers. That's all fancy words for saying you put these things together so they carry the thought through and summarize it at the end of the sentence. They make it live, they make it stick in the reader's memory. He quotes from Joyce Carol Oates. Far from being locked inside our own skins, inside the dungeons of ourselves, we're now able to recognize that our minds belong quite naturally to a collective mind, a mind in which we share everything that is mental, most obviously language itself, and that the old boundary of the skin is not a boundary at all, but a membrane connecting the inner and outer experiences of existence. Now, here's the part that I would focus on, that I want you to see. This is the extravagant part of it. Our intelligence, our wit, our cleverness, our unique personalities, all are simultaneously our own possessions and the world's. There's the extravagance of it. Now, he breaks this all down in great detail, and there are some excellent exercises that you can do if you are of a mind to do so. If you want to be a better writer, work through the exercises in this book. Try to digest this, and it will help you. But that's the gist of the lesson tonight. Now, I would particularly direct you, I think in the syllabus, there is a segment of this that you need to summarize. And if memory serves me, I think that's exercise 9.3 that has to do with adjectives and adverbs, amongst other things. But that's where we will begin. I want to give you back a few minutes tonight. I realize that a little bit of this has been maybe a little bit muddy because I've rushed through it. Go back and read over it. It's worth your time. But more than that, read aloud what you write. Because I promise when you do, when you hear it, you will change it. If you're not comfortable doing that, here's an alternative. Make 2 copies, sit with one, and get a friend, a brother, your wife if you're married, someone else to read it aloud to you. And you'll make changes and notes as they read on your copy. Thank you for being here. I'll look forward to you being here again next time.